The G7 summit is concluding today in Hiroshima, Japan. The summit has been dominated by discussions on Russia's war with Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is urging the world's richest democracies to unite against Moscow and provide his country with more weapons. And he might just get his wish after U.S. President Joe Biden authorized the supply of F-16 fighter jets. Britain has also announced another round of sanctions targeting Russian diamond imports. So let's get more details from eNCA correspondent Chris Gilberts joining us live now from Tokyo. Chris, a very good morning to you. Let's talk a little bit about what's been the highlights of this G7 summit, obviously dominated by what's happening with the Ukraine, and it looks as though Volodymyr Zelensky might just get his wish list of more arms. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's been kind of a donut-shaped G7 if, either side has been dominated by, the war in Ukraine. And on the second day of the 3 days, there was a focus on China and other issues on the table, such as LGBT rights, AI regulations, securing supply chains, food security. But at the start, the first day really was dominated by announcements straight out of the gate of heightened sanctions on Russia as, the G7 countries really look to pull back Russia's ability to continue this war, really targeting the revenue it can get from the global supply of Russian diamonds, oil and precious minerals, looking to crack down on those who are helping Russia to evade sanctions. And then today, the most recent news, the last day, is kind of more of a push factor, pushing Ukraine, to propel it in the conflict. And it may very well be needed as the war wages on. In fact, there is breaking news just happened in the last few minutes because, the camp may be over here with the G7 concluding earlier, but the campfire is still going. There are press conferences galore at the moment. The Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, has been holding a press conference, and also Joe Biden, the U.S. President, has been meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky one-on-one, and there are announcements coming from that. The biggest one really is that Volodymyr Zelensky was reportedly asked if Ukraine was still in control of Bakhmut, the town in Ukraine that had been heavily contested. Russia said the other day has taken control. Ukraine says, no, it hasn't. That's not true. And apparently when Volodymyr Zelensky was asked just minutes ago if Ukraine still held that town, the Ukrainian leader answered, no, it doesn't. So apparently he is conceding that Russia now holds Bakhmut, and it really highlights, the unwavering support that the G7 holds for Ukraine and why they believe it is so absolutely important to supply ammunition. Also reportedly out of that meeting, U.S. President Joe Biden is saying that he is agreeing to supply more ammunition to Ukraine. This was reported earlier in the day as well, north of $300 million in ammunitions, rocket launchers, artillery going into Ukraine. So there is a pull factor with the sanctions, a push factor with the arms, but the overall message stays exactly the same, just as everyone expected it to. It is unwavering support for Ukraine from the G7, unconditional condemnation of Russia for waging this war. The questions that remain is how can the G7 from here, the next steps, convince those partners in the world that it's trying to reach out to, such as South Africa, such as Brazil, such as India, that it wants to convince to join its efforts against the war. How is that going to unfold in the weeks and months to come?
Yeah, I want us to labor a little bit about the geopolitics that are involved here, and especially given where South Africa finds itself. I mean, we're part of the BRICS countries, right? South Africa has, we've seen of recent with the U.S. ambassador speaking about how potentially there was a ship that docked on the shores of South Africa, and allegedly, of course, there were arms heading for Russia that were put inside of that ship coming in from South Africa as a sign of support for Russia in this Ukraine-Russia war. So as it were, obviously certain, revelations have subsequently come out of this, and then the ambassador obviously reneging, saying that he violated perhaps diplomatic channels of being able to communicate such information. But it does not change the plight, for example, of the U.S. to try to convince these countries to come along and join the condemnation against Russia. But it looks as though they're not winning necessarily this particular plight, because I would think that these countries, these sovereign nations, have got their own interests to take care of. I'm sure they don't want to start their own kind of war or kind of poking the bear when it comes to Russia. So it's a tricky balancing act of geopolitics and also being able to hold your own strategic agenda in mind.
Yeah, I mean, you could make a very long list of the balancing acts that are in play here in the G7, in the invitees in the G7, amongst its own members. I mean, where do you want to start, really? The G7 is an organization that sends messages and tries to make a framework for these 7 countries to try and shape the economic order of the world. I mean, that is its mission. Now, how do you do that? You create these intentions, and so if you look at the joint statement and the communiques that are issued by the G7, you know, it's really the same messages over and over again. Okay, what are they going to say about the Taiwan Strait? They're going to say, well, we oppose any unilateral action of aggression to change the status quo. And that's exactly what it says, because that is the message they've come up with that works for them to send a message to China that they don't want any conflict in the Taiwan Strait, but also leaves enough wiggle room inside the tent for these countries to maintain their own bilateral relations and trade dependencies with China. They say they want to cut down on oil, Russia's oil revenue, but Japan, a member country, the host country of the G7 this year, is heavily dependent on Russian energy imports, and they make exceptions for Japan in this regard. And now look at a global south country like India that is not inside the G7 tent, but was of course invited. You know, there's been a lot of talk, and you might see news reports around today about how, Zelensky had a bilateral meeting with Narendra Modi, the leader of India, and there's some reports from America and elsewhere in the world which are saying, that Zelensky is confronting a fence sitter. Well, it depends, how much sway Zelensky has over that matter, because the situation for India, as you mentioned, there's a balancing act, because in the north of India there are disputes and political circumstances that it really needs a strong partnership with Russia. But Russia has very little use to India in the south, in the maritime part of India, and so it looks to Quad, it looks to Japan, it looks to the G7 to maintain those alliances and secure that region. It has a multitude of various interests, and I think and experts I've spoken to have said that a single meeting or a single summit is not really going to change that. So you're right, there is so many balancing acts in play, and that is really the challenge of the G7 going forward, especially looking towards the G20 when Russia and China may become involved again.
Chris, we'll leave it here for this morning. Much appreciated for your time. Of course, eNCA correspondent Chris Gilberts coming to us live from Hiroshima in Japan.